to SQL Bits 2020, the greatest data show, virtual edition. My name's Chris, and today we're going to be talking about database CI/CD with containers, a little bit of Kubernetes, and Azure DevOps. So let's jump straight in. So first of all, we'll start with a little bit about who I am. My name's Chris Taylor. I'm a data platform architect for Data Masterminds. I've been working with SQL Server and data as a whole for around about 20 years now. Seems like a lifetime, almost is. I am heavily involved in the SQL Server, or now data platform community, where I run the Newcastle Data Platform and Cloud and the Newcastle Power BI user groups. I used to play a lot of sport. I still try to play as much sport as I can, but I'm not as young and I'm certainly not as fit as I used to be. So I now concentrate most of my efforts on coaching kids of playing football, cricket, of various ages, ranging from about 5-6 year old all the way up to about 10-11 year old. So what will we be doing today? So we're going to be talking about a lot of things. Got a lot to try and fit in 45 minutes. We're going to be talking about Azure repos, containers, container registry, DevOps pipelines, so the build and release pipelines, and a little bit about Azure Kubernetes service as well, and how we can utilize that as an environment to be pushing our changes out to. Something that's not on the agenda is we're not going to be talking about DevOps practices. We just simply don't have the time. That's something that we could be talking for hours, days, weeks even, as to whether this is the right way to do things or we do it another way. So we can have conversations after the session where we'll be online and we can discuss that. So what do I want you guys to get out of this session today? So we're going to get a little bit of an insight into how Azure DevOps works, how we can build our pipelines, and how we can start integrating those pipelines with containers. There's going to be a lot of demos, primarily demos in this session, where we can run through a lot of the issues that I've experienced in the past from this, and hopefully you will learn from that and not spend many hours like I have trying to fix an issue. Hopefully I'll be able to tell you that so you'll know straight away. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll get the bug for containers and Azure DevOps and start having a bit play around with it all. So for those that aren't familiar with Azure DevOps and what there is a suite of components to allow us to build our full end-to-end development lifecycle. It's not just specific to databases, it's relevant to all development. So you can see here we have quite a lot in there. We have the Azure boards, the repositories, the pipelines, test plans, and even artifacts. But for today, we're going to be focusing primarily on the pipelines themselves. Now, before we jump into the demos, I just want to talk a little bit about what the demo is going to show. So we've got a little bit of a story. I'm a developer. Somebody has asked me to add a new column to a database table, and my job is to make that change, get it up into the relevant dev and test environments, ready for people to start having a look at it. So how we're going to do that, it's using Visual Studio. I've got a database project, be making that change. I will push that up to an Azure repository, an Azure repo. Now that is going to do two things. That will initiate a build, which will then create our DAC pack. There is other ways of doing this and deploying database changes, but we're going to choose DAC packs for today. And that DAC pack we will use it in two areas. First of all, we are going to build a new Docker image with that change that I've made embedded within it. And then what we're going to do with that is we'll push it up to the Azure Container Registry, and ultimately we'll be able to deploy that to whichever environment we want. What we're also going to do to show a different spin on things and how we can do these deployments is we are just going to push those DAC pack changes out to our test and staging environments, and potentially production as well if we wanted to, which is hosted on Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. Now, a question that does come up quite often with this is where do we test? I've had many debates with Rob Sewell about this as well, but where in this process is the best place to test? Do we deploy it and then we start running tests? Do we put the tests as part of the image build, the Docker image that we're trying to create? Do we want it to fail before it creates the image? Or do we want to create the image, run the tests, and then kill the process afterwards? Well, what this demo is going to show is both. We're going to do both test plans here. We're going to test as we build the image, and I'll show you how I've had to modify that using T-SQL-T in order to actually kill the build process if indeed a test fails. And we'll also be pushing out to the Azure Kubernetes service, deploying the changes, and we'll also be running some T-SQL-T tests and pester tests if you so desire as well. So a little bit about the Docker image and how it's going to look at the end of all this. So those who are familiar with Docker and containers will know that essentially an image is a union-layered file system. So we always start with our base image, our operating system, and then anything that we want to add into it, it just keeps getting added to the writable layer above it. So in our case, we're going to have an Ubuntu image with SQL Server 2019. I've had to copy the SQL package.exe process into that image as well in order to deploy a DAC pack. Back in 2017, that used to exist, but they then made some changes and removed it, fixed some issues they had with it, but they never put it straight back into the SQL Server on Linux images. If you want it in there, they have made it available for you to put in. So that will be in there as well. As part of this, we will then copy the DAC pack and the T-SQL-T tests into the image. We will deploy those changes, run the tests, and then we will have our newly created image pushed up to our container registry. And that's it for the slides. I said it was going to be demo heavy, so 8 minutes in and we're straight there. So we talked about the story of Chris Taylor, the developer, needing to make a change, and that change is to modify a table called demo and just add a column, and we're just going to call it test. Very, very simple change, as basic as it gets, not wanting to overcomplicate things, but essentially any change that we make, this will work for, but for the purposes of this demo, we're making it as easy as possible. So I'm going to change that. So we've now added that new column called test into our database project. And I am now going to push that change up to our Azure repo. So I've just put a nice message in saying I've deployed new column. I'm going to commit that change locally and then push it up to our repository. And what that's going to do, that is going to initiate a build automatically. And what we're going to do for the first part of these demos is go through the process of how we can do that. We're not going to be able to go through the release side of things because we only have 45 minutes. It will take a little bit longer to walk you through all that. If I was to be doing this end to end, just by myself, for myself, then yes, it certainly would be possible to do that. So this is Azure DevOps, for those that haven't seen it. In here at the moment, I have a number of projects, one specifically built for SQL Bits here, which is Demo Proj. And within that project, you will see now that we have everything I mentioned before about the components, where we have the boards, the repos, the pipelines, the test plans. It's all in here. So if we want to prove that our change has now been pushed up, I can go to the repos, files, essentially the same folder structure as what we saw in the database project. And if I look in the demo table, we now have our test column, which I've just created. So we know that that's now in source control. And with that, we can see that this build that I've already pre-built in true Blue Peter style, demo proj backup for SQL bits, that has now been triggered, and that in the background is going to do the build, so we have the full end-to-end to look at properly once we've went through our own process building here. So the first thing we want to do is we've created a change in a database project. In order to deploy that, we're going to create a DAC pack. So we want to automate that. I don't want to be running any manual code as much as I can. So once we have this built, we should never have to do it again. So I'm going to look at the pipelines, specifically the build pipelines, and I'm going to create a new one. Now at this point, you have a couple of options. Microsoft seem to be forcing you down the route of learning YAML. It's a very, very useful thing to get to grips with. It's not necessarily straightforward initially, but once you do have an understanding, it's phenomenal. And that's where these options come from. Initially, it's asking you, where is your code? Which source control provider is it? And there's many options in there. But what we can do, since this is more of an introductory session, we're going to go through the classic GUI editor, and we'll be able to run through that. So in here, again, same thing, it's going to ask us where is our source, and obviously it's automatically picked up my project, which was demo proj, and the Azure repo that it's in. Now you may have many branches in there that you want to build from, maybe an integration branch or development branch, whatever it may be, but I'm just going to choose master for the purposes of this demo. If you did have multiple branches, they would be listed in that drop down. Now, to make things a little easier for you, they do spoon feed you quite a lot with this. They've given you a lot of templates that you could choose from. So if you knew you were doing something with Azure Cloud services or Kubernetes services, or even Jenkins, there is a template already there. But we're going to start from scratch with an empty job and just run from there instead. And this is it. This is our build pipeline. Nothing much really to see at the moment, but we will start adding jobs and steps to this process. So the first thing to be looking at is at the very top level here, we have our build pipeline. And in here, you have the option, if I drop that down, of where you want this process to run. So essentially the agent pool. Do you want Microsoft and Azure essentially to host it and run all the processing for you? Or do you want to create your own agent pool and run it on your laptop or in another virtual machine somewhere? You've got that option. I will try and show you both, certainly with the release side of it, as to whether or not we use Azure pipelines or we use our own hosted pipeline, hosted pool. We can do. It's entirely up to you. So with that, if you choose the Azure, you've got a couple of different options in here. You know, if you've got Mac OS, you've got Ubuntu, Windows, Visual Studio. Now each of these agents will have different tools installed. So depending on what it is you're wanting to do will dictate what you are, or which one you're going to choose. It may be that they don't have the tools that you need, so you have to create your own hosted agent, and that's fine. But like I said, there is some here ready built with everything you need. Now, because the first thing we're going to do is build what is essentially a Visual Studio database project, I'm going to choose VS 2017 running on Windows 2016. Get sources. If you realise you've made a mistake and it's not actually an Azure repo, it's in GitHub or something like that, you could change that here. But essentially we chose that when we first came in. Agent job number 1. So what are we going to do? We're going to give it a name. I'm going to call this build DAC pack, because that's essentially what we're doing. At this point we could change the agent pool and use our own hosted agent, or again we can just inherit from the main pipeline. So it gives you the flexibility to swap between them if indeed you do need a Linux one, which we will come to in a moment. But I'm just going to leave it as inherit. And that is pretty much all you need to be configuring for the job, the agent job. There's nothing else really to configure. We will talk about the dependencies, which is down here, when we come to job number 2. So we will do that. So this job isn't really doing anything at the moment. It just exists. So we need to start adding some steps. Now, this may take a second or two to actually load, but here is a list of tasks that we can use and start adding to our job itself. I don't know if you can quite see the size of that scroll bar, but if I'm scrolling down, that there's hundreds, thousands, lots and lots, as I would say to the kids, what you can choose from. But I know that I'm wanting something that's going to build this Visual Studio project. So I'm going to filter it, and there is a task called Visual Studio Build. So I'm going to add that. And if we jump into it, we can then start configuring this quite easily. So the first thing it's going to ask for is, what is your solution? So I can navigate straight to my repo. This is my demo project that we had, and straight to the solution. And that allows me to select that so it knows that this is what it's going to build. If you want to change the Visual Studio version, you can do. I'm just going to leave it as latest. If you've got any build arguments that you want to pass in, and in this case we will have, which leads me on quite nicely to the concept of variables. Now, you can either start creating your own variables to use within the tasks in the pipeline, or you can create a variable group, and that's what I've done. I've already created one for the build and a one for the release. So it's just a suite of variables to make my life a little bit easier. So in here, you will see down this side, we have the variable names, and then obviously the value, what it refers to. So we are at the process of the deploying or the building of the Visual Studio project, the database project. So I have a variable called msBuildArgs, and what that does is that's essentially just telling me where do I want to push that change to, or that build output to. I want it to be an output directory to something called b.basd. Now you're probably thinking or asking the question, what is BASD? And it is a very good question. But if we look up here, we have another variable, so we've referenced that, and what that refers to is a system variable within Azure DevOps called build.artifact staging directory. Now we will be using b.basd in a few different places, and it's a lot easier than typing out the words build.artifact staging directory. You don't have to do it this way. I'm not going to enforce this. It just makes life a little bit easier if you can start parameterizing things. So if we jump back into the tasks, I can go back to the msBuild arguments, and any variable that you're going to use, you have to wrap in brackets prefixed with $, otherwise it won't pick it up. And then that is pretty much it. You do have other options for this process, whether you want an 86, 32-bit or 64-bit build process, but I'm just going to leave it as 32 because what we're doing is fairly straightforward. Doesn't need anything 64-bit with a requirement. And that will build our solution and create our DAC pack. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to copy over some other files in order to start building our Docker image. Now in the database project itself, I have a suite of other files in here, which includes things like Pesta tests, tsqlt, and some YAML for the Kubernetes as well. I need to get those files from the repo into the agent, or across to the agent, or certainly the pipeline, in order to start utilizing them later down the line. So this copy files task, I'm going to come in, I'm going to choose my source folder. I'm just going to choose the root, this provisioning folder, which has everything in there. But I need to put \* in order to make that a recursive copy, so I get everything. Target folder, we mentioned before, the build artifact staging directory, shortened to BASD. And that's all we need for that process. We're just copying the files from the repo into that directory, ready for when we want to make these files and the DAC pack as well, as including those files, readily available to the rest of the pipeline, because we're now going to switch to a different job, which will ultimately run on a different host, and they don't necessarily know about each other, because these are created, does the processing, and then disappears. So I'm going to publish these files as an artifact and making them available to the rest of the process here. Now you'll see it automatically is picked up build artifact staging directory, which, if everyone can remember, was the same as our BSD. Now, because of OCD, I'm just going to make that change. So it keeps everything the same. We want to give the artifact a name. It's drop by default. You can call it whatever you like. And where do we want to publish this to? We can just publish it to the pipeline, so it continues through and available, or you could actually create or have a file share and push these changes out to there for other people to be able to access. And that's it for the build process. So a quick recap on that: we've built our DAC pack, we've copied all the other files we need, and we're now making them available. The next stage is we're going to create a new job, but I'm going to call this deploy DAC pack. Now this is deploying the DAC pack specifically for the Docker images themselves. Now, because we're running SQL Server on Linux, and it's a SQL Server on Linux image that we're going to be using, I need to choose a different Azure pipeline, or agent host, sorry. And again, you can come in here and you could just choose the Linux one. If you've got a Linux machine and it's already hosted or already configured to host, you could choose it from the drop down. But I'm just going to choose Ubuntu 16.04. And that is allowing us now to start utilizing some more Linux commands. I mentioned earlier about dependencies. Something very important once you start having multiple jobs is to say, what is this job dependent on? So I'm saying this job itself, this agent job, can't run until the previous one has, or has previously succeeded. If I don't put that in, this will just randomly run either job. And obviously we want the first job to run first and the second job to run second. Otherwise we're going to try and deploy something that doesn't exist. So something that can be missed and can cause a lot of issues, but definitely something to be aware of. So the next thing we want to do is we want to download the artifacts that we just pushed. And you've got options here. You can either choose the artifact as a whole. It won't give me the name drop because I haven't ran the process, so therefore it doesn't exist yet. Or you can just say, I just want to pull down all the files from that location. Now, because we're on Linux, you will notice here I've had to swap to a /. And where do we want to put it? Again, I've created a variable in here called Docker target folder, and that's taking us to the default working directory provisioning Docker file folder, and that will create that for us. And that's on the new Linux agent. So if I update that, That means now it will pull those changes down to that new folder and we can start using them. And what we can do now is we want to build a new Docker image. We're at that point already. So there is a Docker task. You have got Docker Compose as well if you've got multi-container setup. But again, this is just a SQL Server Linux one. Now I'm just going to, there's a couple of options with this which I'll quickly show you. If I can get back into here. You'll notice with the tasks, some of them will just have version 0, but this one's obviously went through a number of different releases, and that can catch you out because when a new version is released, they obviously can make changes, and they have done, and that's caused me a lot of problems in the past. So just be careful, you know, if you've created a pipeline previously and it may have been using task version 1, you create a new one, it automatically defaults to the new one, which can look and work very different. So with the Docker task, certainly version 2, we've got options of what exactly we want to do. We can do a build and push at the same time, or create a task to build and then a task to push, log in, log out, start and stop. So for simplicity, I'm just going to choose build and push. We could create a separate task and split them up, but again, we will, just to make it easy for everybody, we'll just use the one that does both. Now, because we are using Azure and we're essentially logged in with my subscription, everything just links together. So it now knows that I've got a container repository. And we can create different services and connections to other things as well, but you'll see with a lot of the drop downs it just automatically picks up what we've got. So I've got a container registry called JCL ACR, and within that, unfortunately, it doesn't give you the repositories within that registry, but I know I've got one called Azure DevOps. I'm going to do a build and a push. I'm going to choose my Docker file. If I go into provisioning, Docker file, I'm going to choose a 2019 one. Build context, can leave it as it is, and that'll just look for that Docker file. And we can create an image with multiple tags. Used to have to use a text file for this, but now we can just enter it as it is. So I'm just going to have one that's got the build ID, so it's image name with a tag of the build ID, image name, latest. And that is essentially it. That will create our new, well, our changes have been made. We've added our new column. We've pushed that to the repository, so it's in source control. We've built our new DAC pack, which can be used in the release side of things as well, which we'll show you in a moment. And we've also created, once this runs, a new Docker image with that change embedded in it. So what we'll do is we will quickly jump into that and show you how that looks when it has been running. So you'll see this run here, which is the deploy new column, which is the change or the comment that I added. Couple of jobs here, build DAC pack and deploy DAC pack. And it shows you each of the individual steps here and the output that we get. So this is the build showing us that our AdventureWorks LT 2017 DAC pack has been created. Copying the files, so all those from the provisioning folder, and publishing the artifact to the drop. And then into the deploy, we're downloading the artifacts. You can add tasks as well, something that to be aware of. The folder structures can be quite confusing at first as to where things actually go, you know, whether it's the build artifact staging directory or artifact directory. You know, there's lots of different areas you can go to there. So sometimes a bit of troubleshooting, you can have just do a get child item just to work out what files exist in which folder. But in the example that I did, that I showed you before when we were building, I had a Docker task which did a build and a push together. In this example, I'm showing it where it's split. So we've got a task to build and a task to push. For those of you that have seen Docker before, you will see here we have all our intermediary containers being created for each of the individual steps in the Docker file, which I'll quickly run through in a moment. And then a little bit further down, we will see the T-SQL tests that we've ran. Unfortunately, it has succeeded, which is good. We're happy with that. Very simple test, and it was only a single test, but it has succeeded. And that allowed it to continue on with the build. So what I'll do is I'll show you the Docker file. So remember, we chose the Docker file CI 2019. Fairly standard initially. We have our base image. Now this is already modified with the SQL package.exe existing in it. I've created a DAC pack folder and I'm going to copy files into it. I am passing in argument for SA password, some of the environment variables, and then this is where I'll call it the magic happens. Yeah. So in order to deploy a DAC pack, when you're building a new image, as part of that image build, and ultimately this Docker file, we have to start SQL Server, run SQL package.exe, passing in the DAC pack that we want to deploy, and then that then allows me, because SQL Server is up and running, I can create T-SQL-T, I can add any additional tests that I've got and run them, and then ultimately drop and clean up after myself, get rid of T-SQL-T entirely. Now, what I mentioned earlier on, and something to note, is that as standard with T-SQL-T, if you encounter an error or failed test, it only raises an error of severity 16, which isn't enough to fail a Docker build. So I've had to modify this T-SQL-T class to change that severity up to 20 to make sure that it does fail the Docker build. So there's something to be mindful of if you're wondering why a test failed but the image was still created. And then, bizarrely, because of this, we have to kill SQL Server, and then, as with all containers, it's got to run under process ID 1, so we tell it to keep it running in the background again when you initiate a new container from it. So that's how we can deploy a DAC pack into an image as part of a build. Now, the other way to be looking at deploying is we can release to an environment. It could be an on-premise environment, an Azure VM with SQL Server on it, Azure SQL database. In this case, I've just created an Azure Kubernetes service with a couple of nodes and mounting some volumes and put some namespaces in there to separate the environments, just to keep it like a one-stop shop where everything can be deployed to. So now that we've done our build, we've been through that and we've had a look at that, we can then decide to push this out to the environments. And you'll see here that I've already ran this a few times as part of testing, ready for this session itself. So if I jump in and have a look at the pipeline itself, now what we are doing here, first thing we're doing is we're grabbing essentially our artifact, difficult to say that, with essentially what are we going to deploy. And so when you come in here, you've got the option of choosing what it is. Is it a DAC pack? Is it something else? Is it a NuGet file? Whatever it may be. But I'm choosing where's the source. It's from this pipeline, and I can give it a new alias if I wanted to. And within that, I can decide whether or not I want continuous deployment with this. So when it builds, or when it knows that something has changed in that artifact location, something has been dropped in there, it will initiate a new release. And it's as simple as clicking that enable button. Then that will move into the stages area, where we have at the moment 4 environments. I've got a single development environment test, staging and production, and a bit of a gated process with production, just so somebody has to press a button to say yes, I'm happy, everything's passed, before we push out. So we'll quickly have a look at the development environment, because we've already been talking about the Docker image, and this is slightly different to the other ones. So in the development environment, this could be multiple development environments or developer machines, let's call it, when we are now of the ability where we can pull down that Docker image and just have our own dev environment with these changes already in there. And we can do that by essentially just having a kube control get, checking whether the deployment exists already in that environment. If it is, then we can drop it. Let's delete it. So we've got a Kubernetes tasks, and within that you've got the different commands where you can choose, do I want to delete, do I want to get, do I want to apply, choose your namespace, and you've also got the ability to hook directly into your Kubernetes cluster by creating a service connection. So we'll very quickly have a look at that. In the service connections, if I go back a step, you will see a list of the ones I already have, and this is as easy as clicking new service. I want a new Kubernetes connection, and I was saying about the Azure subscription, it will load my subscription up, and with that, whichever one I chose, it will then see what Kubernetes clusters I have available and allow me to choose them. And as you can see, I've got a couple here readily available. So nice and easy, and that allows us to start using that connection directly into our release pipelines. So I've connected to this cluster in the dev namespace. I found that it exists, so I'm just going to clear it out, and I'm going to create a new deployment in this AKS environment under, again, the dev namespace, to deploy the new image that we've just created. Now, if you remember, I added a tag for the latest, which makes things a little bit easier. You could always try and work out what's the highest build number, but this is the YAML, very basic for deploying of that, and I'm just telling it to pull from the Azure Container Registry the new image that I've just created. So that's the deployment of the Docker image. We can do it another way if we jump into the deployment of the test environment, where we are just going to deploy the DAC pack itself. Now, similar to what we saw in the build process, we've got different tasks. We're going to download the files to this agent. We've got a deploy DAC pack task, where we can go in and choose the DAC pack that's been created from the drop folder. Remember, that's our artifact location. Pass in server names. Again, I've parameterized this, create variable names with the IPs. Same with the SA password, so I'm not storing the SA password in here. If we look at the variables in the group that I've got, you will see that this is hashed. So it just makes things a little bit secure, or a little bit more secure, sorry, as opposed to typing in SA passwords into a DevOps pipeline. There is T-SQL-T tasks. Now, something to be aware of with these is they're only available on Windows-based agents. They don't work on the Linux ones, or certainly last time I tried. So something to be aware of. And we can run T-SQL-T tests. There is the option for pester tests, and ultimately we can output the results, either JUnit, NUnit, whichever result format you're going to use. So if we have a look at that release in action, so release number 33 is the one that was triggered, and the good news is we can see that after the build succeeded, it automatically initiated this deployment, which is pushed out to test. Oops, sorry about that. It succeeded. I've not put any gated process in here, so it will just go straight into staging as well, as long as it passes the tests. If it fails the test, it will fail that deployment and this new dev environment with the new image already deployed to it. And we can have a look again at the logs in here, very similar to what we saw in the build side of things, where we've got all the output nice, neat and tidy for us there. And then hopefully, if we run, this is me connected to the AKS, the Azure Kubernetes Services dev namespace, not named instance. And we can see now we have our test column available there. And if I just run a select, very easy select star, you'll see that that's appeared. I've got no data in there, but it's just proof of the pudding that it has in fact went through from the developer, me making the change, committing it, pushing it up to the repo. It's now went full end to end without me actually having to do anything other than make the change itself. So that's the end of the demo. So we're going to jump back into the slides just as a bit of a recap in the last couple of minutes. So as a recap, there's pros and cons of doing what I showed before. It's very much down to whether or not you want stateless or stateful containers. But having your container with the database in there, it's everything a container should be. Portable, it's a one-stop shop. Everything you need in order to run that environment exists in that image. The downside of that is this will only work with very small databases. If you have a very large database, even something that's 20 gig, that will make the image at least 20 gig in size, which makes it difficult for pulling images down. So that's why I've shown it very much as a development environment, where you might have a cut down version of the database, possibly just the schema itself with no data. But it allows developers to have something to work with without waiting for a development environment to be refreshed or pulling down a large database to their local machines to play around with. Container image build fails if a test fail, and if you want to persist data whilst doing this, you have to have your own self-hosted agents. This is for the building of the Docker image itself. Azure Kubernetes Services obviously has its own way of persisting data up there. Run through the Docker image file again just to show that this is what we built as part of it. So we just copied the new DAC pack to it, ran T-SQL, ran T-SQL-T, and then we've got our new image there ready to use. So Azure DevOps as a whole, as you saw, very, very easy to get started with. Didn't take long to start adding tasks and making changes. And as you saw, as a whole, end to end, the benefits you get out of having this, once you've put the time and effort in up front to get everything built, you saw all I did was added a column, clicked commit and push, and then that's it. It's pushed out to the environments. No longer do I have to manually run scripts or ask this person to do that. Can you do this? And it just takes time. Human error comes into it and you start making mistakes. You could actually take things a little bit further and have the build or the release process create the Kubernetes environment if you so wanted. It does take anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes, so I just had it already pre-built and it's just constantly running in the background. T-SQL-T integration, I mentioned the tasks are there and they are great, but they're Windows agent only. You can reverse engineer the YAML out of these tasks if you want to create your own YAML pipelines. I've found it's hit and miss as to whether or not that works. If you're struggling with the folder structure, create your own self-hosted agent. Very, very easy to do. I've got one, the release side of it is built off my laptop. But the biggest thing for me, like anything in the cloud, is this is constantly changing. When I span up my Kubernetes cluster 3 days ago to get prepped for this session, my scripts no longer worked. And it wasn't that long ago that I had last spun it up. So there was a big change between version 1.17.0 of AKS and 1.17.3, which was enough for my scripts to stop working. So it's the same with the DevOps. When you move to different tasks, different versions, something to be mindful of. bit of a summary of what we've ran through, my contact details, which I will leave up, and I say thank you very much for attending this session. Hope you got a lot out of it, and enjoy the rest of SQL Bits. Thank you very much.